5 months ago, exactly, Erin Taylor emailed to ask if I would facilitate a conversation among the 5 superstar deans you see on the panel here today. And I was ecstatic. Each of these women has been a friend and mentor and inspiration to me and to so many others. And so I wrote back immediately in all caps, which is rare for me. Yes, that sounds amazing. That's what I said. And I followed it with 3 exclamation points. And I added, I'll share this with you today. This is what I said. This is my, quote, jumping up and down with excitement voice. Just so it was completely clear how really thrilled I was and am still to be here. My only lament at the time was that I would have to wait until December, and here we are. So it is my distinct pleasure to facilitate this conversation among the 5 Black women deans who have generously joined us today. Together, they were selected to be the inaugural recipients of the AALS Impact Award in recognition of the extraordinary work that they are performing as organizers of Law Dean's Antiracist Clearinghouse project, which is the subject of our discussion today. So I will now just briefly introduce them individually by name and by title, and I'll invite you to read their very impressive bios in the AccessLex Legal Education Research Symposium webpage. Danielle M. Conway is Dean and Donald J. Farage Professor of Law at Penn State Dickinson Law. Danielle Holly Walker is Dean and Professor of Law at Howard University School of Law. Kimberly Mutcherson is Co-Dean and Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School in Camden. Angela Onwuachi-Willig is Dean and Professor of Law at Boston University School of Law. And Carla Pratt is Dean and Professor of Law at Washburn University. So as we begin this conversation today, I recognize the importance of being clear about the terminology and our stated goals. And to do that, we have to understand, what do we mean by anti-racism? And so just as an introductory matter, I invite each of the panelists to answer in just a sentence or 2, or perhaps with a short narrative from your own experience that illustrates anti-racism in action. So again, what is anti-racism?
So I would say that that anti-racism means that you are actively engaged in challenging things that are racist actions and racist policies, as my colleague at BU, Dr. Ibram Kendi, would say. And, you know, racism can be defined in a variety of ways, but racist policies are policies that assume that that particular groups are inherently inferior to other groups, that blame particular groups for disparities, right? And explain the groups by the individuals or by the actions of a particular group versus by structural dimensions or by, barriers that are sort of more systemic. And anti-racism means that you are engaged actively, right, in doing the work of challenging any policies, practices, any actions that really facilitate either that belief or continuing inequities, disparities along racial lines, or we believe that those explain, right, real differences between people, or even believe that race itself is something that is real, right, that is tied to it. And I would echo what my colleague says, is that, you know, there's no neutrality in the struggle against racism, that either one is racist or one is anti-racist.
Thank you. Would others like to chime in?
I could give examples at both ends of the spectrum. So today, I'm calling today, December 3rd, my anti-racism day, because from 7:30 in the morning until now, I've been meeting with various university groups, I've been meeting with various faculty groups about Penn State University's Presidential Commission on Racism, Bias, and Community Safety report. And so to echo some of what Dean Onwuachi-Willig is saying, there are some people in these groups who are at very different phases of this work. And so some are acknowledging racism and bias exists. Some are not acknowledging. Some are saying, well, I don't do anything to promote an anti-Black platform, so I'm okay. And others are saying, hey, that's not enough. So that was one spectrum of the work today. And then the second one was when I was talking to my faculty colleague, and she had a wonderful, discrete approach to anti-racist teaching. And she says, I've been looking through my property book, and I don't see any cases about the Amistad in my property book. I'm going to create a problem around that case when I teach property in the spring so that I could include this in the discourse. And so it was very interesting to see across the spectrum these points at which people are in approaching anti-racist action and anti-racist philosophy.
I think the only thing I would add to that is just from the perspective of our law schools and the idea of recruiting students to law school, graduating students from law school, promoting faculty hiring, the promotion of staff and senior staff. I think in the Antiracist Clearinghouse project, there's notion that we have to start at home, right? And so what Dean Conway was just saying is it is hard for us to work in the world and to claim that we want criminal justice reform, that we want education reform, that we want climate justice and environmental racism to stop if we don't have anti-racist law schools, right? And this notion that we must work at the beginning as we're doing the other work to make sure that the institutions that we work in take on an anti-racist stance. And I think one thing that we've seen since this summer is this notion that I think is really one that we have not seen in the past, that a law school is either racist or it's anti-racist, right? And that is something that I think for students, faculty, staff, and university administration is something that we are confronting anew in some ways, that very stark statement and what that demands for us to do in the face of that statement.
Mira, some of what other people have said has reminded me of your great work on faculty hiring, and I think it illustrates some great examples of sort of racist policies, right? So some of the markers that people use to identify who's qualified for a faculty position or not, that really might have a disproportionate impact on particular groups, whether it be instead of focusing on the actual skills that are needed for the job, right, which is so scholarship, teaching, service, people using things as proxies for it. So like, where did you go to school? Where did you go to law school? Or, or who did you clerk for? Those things that don't really directly tell you about someone's performance of the job, but they're being used for proxies. But when you look at the numbers of, for example, clerks of color, they're almost non-existent, right? You're excluding many, many people if you have that be a requirement. Something as well, like the LSAT is a requirement for getting admissions to college. But of course, we know that there are deep wealth disparities. And so access to taking the LSAT, studying for it, can be a barrier. And for example, the Law School Admissions Council was really fantastic at eliminating some of those barriers. So they work with Khan Academy to create this course, right, that was anti-racist work, in creating this course that gave people more access to a way for studying for the LSAT. Their fee waiver system is a great anti-racist action to sort of in sort of creating greater access to law schools, right? That gives that. And so I think law schools also ask ourselves, do we have any such policies? Do we send waivers to students who might diversify our school populations, right? Are we engaged in that kind of anti-racist work?
Thank you. Dean Pratt or Dean Mutcherson, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I want to add, I mean, obviously folks have covered a lot of ground here, but the thing that I really want to reiterate is this idea that being anti-racist is an action, right? That it's not enough to say, I'm not racist. It's not enough to say, I'm raising my kids to be colorblind, these things that actually are not particularly helpful at all, that you actually have to be engaged in this work. And that often means being challenged and challenging other people. And that's, I think, where people sort of, fall off the wagon a little bit, where they feel like if I'm doing the right thing in my own life, then I'm doing the work. And that's not actually work, right? And it's not something that's going to change structures. It's just about sort of you feeling good about yourself, which is fine. But then you don't get to say that you're a part of the work.
I'm so glad that you mentioned colorblindness, Dean Mutcherson, because in my mind, colorblindness is a form of racism, because to say, oh, I'm colorblind is to ignore the racial inequities that continue to exist and to have no concern for them, right? And so in my mind, I think, just as everyone else has said, being anti-racist isn't a state of being, it's a state of acting, a state of doing. And we all should ask ourselves, what are we doing to create racial equity and mitigate the existing white racial dominance over people of color? And if you are engaging in color blindness, you probably aren't even aware of the places and the spaces where white racial dominance continues to exist. And so you're not actively engaged in trying to disrupt that. You're accepting that as a natural state of existence. And it's not a natural state of existence. It's a state of existence that was created through years of racialized oppression. And only through anti-racist action are we going to disrupt that racial oppression.
So collectively, then, it sounds like a key understanding for anti-racism is recognizing that there is no middle ground, and that your association or identification with being anti-racist really is dependent on your actions. It's not enough to believe something, but you actually have to put your actions behind those words. And so clearly you all have worked together to inspire this action through the Law Dean's Antiracist Clearinghouse. Many of us have seen the Law Dean's Antiracist Clearinghouse website. A number of schools have already been working to implement its proposals. Many of us on this panel and also many people in the audience, I'm sure, have been involved in those initiatives at various law schools already. And since we have you all here together, I'd love a behind the scenes look. So can you share a little bit about how this project began and how it was developed? That this can cover inspirations for the project, maybe any hiccups on the path to making it a reality, if you want to share those, how you decided to prioritize particular elements, and how you decided on the particular common goals that are shared in the project.
So I'm going to nominate Dean Conway to start. So there.
Touche.
I second that.
So you see how this all came about. These are wonderful, wonderful Black women. And these are the women who I called upon after we all collectively learned about the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police impunity. And the reason why it hit so hard was because it wasn't George Floyd. It was all of the other murders and killings that preceded it. There was this crescendo, this cascade that just overwhelmed me. And many of you know, I have a 9-year-old son, and I was paralyzed thinking about what this meant in his development and his safety. And so I called up Dean Unwachi-Willig, and I just unloaded because I said, I cannot act as a dean and a leader in this space at this moment because I am paralyzed by this hatred, by this inhuman activity that is ongoing. And we talked for hours. I mean, she talked me off of a ledge there, talked me down. And I had moments to think about it and knew that I had to lead at the law school. I knew I had to respond to our students about this. I knew that I had to step up. And instead of trying to do that alone, I thought about what I was thinking about in my own mind. And I said, I need the energy and I need the power of the sisterhood to help me get through this. And so I called on these women on this call and I said, I have to show you something. I just have to show you what I'm grappling with. And I think my colleague and my friend, Dean Pratt, says it really well, so I'll save it for her. But when I called, they answered. And I said, we have to respond to this. I said, we have to do something. And then just like the voices in a choir, all the voices came together and it was not one voice. It was all of our voices. And it became uplifting. It really became something that was wholesome and something that was empowering. And we came up right on that very call. It didn't take more than 45 minutes. And we said, well, here it is. Here's the structure. Now let's just work this out. And there's your ALS Law Dean's Antiracist Clearinghouse project. You mentioned, Mira, is really funny. You said, what were the hiccups? There were no hiccups. We got together on a Friday. It was done on a Monday. It was terrific.
Dean Pratt, I feel like the baton has been passed to you to elaborate.
So Dean Conway video called me and she just held up a collage of photos and she didn't say a word, but I knew that the faces looking at me in that collage of photographs were the faces of Black people whose lives had been taken through police action. And then she held up another photo collage, and it was the one that Evangeline Mitchell created of all the Black law school deans who are serving, because we have a record number of Black deans serving in ABA-approved law schools. And so the juxtaposition of those two, it was clear that any one of us on the law dean's collage could be a person on the other collage, a person who was assumed to be a violent criminal, assumed to be a threat to life and gunned down or have our lives taken through police action without, under color of law and without consequence under law. And so, she didn't have to say a word. The photographs spoke for themselves, and I knew we needed to do something because I too have a Black son whose, face I could see as I watched the life of George Floyd slip away. And I was struggling and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to start. And so I was really pleased to get Dean Conway's call and pleased to be included and thankful for her leadership on this.
I think one of the pieces of the puzzle that really came together here was, after George Floyd was murdered in this sort of week or so after that happened, a lot of us sent messages to our communities. And the messages that came from those of us who are Black law deans were very personal in a lot of ways. I mean, in my message, I talked about my kids. Danielle talked about hers. Angela talked, it was more than just being a person who was a law dean and I need to respond to this as somebody who's running a law school, right? It was really understanding that we, on one hand, have this relatively powerful role, which is really terrific. But on the other hand, have a very personal vulnerability, and our children have a very personal vulnerability. So it was this really wonderful moment where we could, lead in a way that was powerful, but that was also coming from our own personal experience, which is one of the things that I think is so great about the fact that we have so many women law deans, and particularly Black women law deans, at this time. I mean, this is, I can't imagine a different time to be a law dean, because what we're able to do now, and certainly what we're able to do as a group, I think is much more impactful than might have been the case, 10 or 15 years ago when there were so few of us, 5 years ago, frankly, when there were so few of us.
Dean Holly Walker or Dean Onwuachi-Willig, did you want to add more about particular elements that you thought through, or how you arrived at the goals and the particular steps that are included?
Well, I guess one thing I wanted to say is that one thing I thought that was really, really powerful about this group, and I think, Danielle said this, and it's really echoed in everything that everyone said, that Dean Conway said, that Dean Mutcherson, that Dean Pratt said, is that, we were sort of also discussing, we had a Zoom call, we had private conversations with each other, but we were emailing, we were kind of all discussing some of the ways that we were sort of grappling with how to use our voice and whether and when to use our voice, and some of the sort of unspoken assumptions about how deans should speak in these particular instances. And I think at some point it really just dawned on us that really when these unspoken assumptions were kind of created or like thought up or sort of implicitly communicated, they were communicated and sort of set when deans didn't look like us. And so there were a lot of assumptions about how deans should respond and think that were really based on the notion of a white male dean who is generally viewed, even though they have a race, as raceless, whose experiences are generally viewed as normative, right? And so I think for us, it was also freeing for us to really sort of, and it has been freeing for us to really be in constant conversation and in connection with each other, because it's a good reminder that, this is a new mold, and that the old mold that was set was one that was set without us in mind. And so it makes sense for us to be responding and acting differently.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think for me, I felt like this was a lifeline in many ways, because I think the idea that we would write these statements, right? I had always had a lot of trouble. I became dean of Howard in July of 2014, only a few weeks before Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And so with every one of these instances, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, there were deans that issued statements. There were deans that didn't. I never did, because I was like, I felt like the work and the mission of our law school was my statement, right? Was what I intended to do. But in reading, the statements by Dean Onwuachi-Willig, reading the statements by all the women in this group, I just really felt like, okay, there's not only more for us to do, but there are a lot of deans out there who for years maybe issued these statements or did not, but there was nothing that happened afterwards. What is the collective responsibility that we have as law school deans and leaders in the legal profession, leaders in the profession that have the core responsibility for making the policy and legal changes that could actually address this issue? What is our responsibility beyond writing these statements? And I think the Clearinghouse has really opened up the opportunity for some deans who maybe felt a little powerless, right? Colleagues who maybe had good intentions but did not know where to go from here. And so when you talk about the phases of, learning and listening and audit, and the iterative phase, all of those phases really say, for someone who would have, a year ago said, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. I think what the Clearinghouse has done is allowed people to say, okay, now I have a resource. If I felt like I didn't have one, even though all the resources were in many ways were there, they're now in one place so that a law school dean, law school students, faculty, staff can feel empowered to take on some of this work for themselves through this project.
And I think what it's also spawned is this collective voice among law deans. And so I think in many ways, this group of wonderful, amazing, powerful women created a template for how deans across the nation could collectively respond. So some of the outgrowth of our collective voice has been the ABA Police Practices Consortium, begun, and the emails were sent today, 52 law schools signing on to that work. I don't know if that work would have happened without the ALS Law Dean's Anti-Racist Clearinghouse project.
And well, and all the anti-racism resolutions too. I mean, I think that, you know, when Penn State came out with Penn State Dickinson Law School came out with its first, you know, the first anti-racism resolution, unanimous, right? I think it really did set a standard and really, okay, this is something that faculties could speak in one particular voice, and I thought that was really powerful. I mean, for me, it was something that I didn't even expect to see, and so I thought it was amazing that it happened, and then to see so many other schools follow suit, and so. You know, I think to see follow suit for the work that Dean Conway was able to do out of Penn State Dickinson was really incredible. The other thing I want to say in connection to what Dean Holly Walker said is I think tacked onto that, and it reminds me of your work, Professor Deo, is that also I think that the existence of the Clearinghouse also helps to take some of the burden of teaching and guiding off of people of color, faculty of color, maybe even junior faculty of color, right? So if you think about who gets asked to do this work when these issues blow up in a particular law school or become, right, it's usually, you know, faculty of color or staff of color, and often the faculty of color are untenured or, you know, overburdened already. And having this work there, it's really sort of like, it's really your responsibility to learn on your own and to listen on you. I mean, so all those things is like, I think the Clearinghouse is also important in that it also does the work of sort of taking some of that burden off of people of color who are already burdened with doing this extra work that in legal academia.
Those are all really powerful narratives. I can feel the emotion in your voices talking about it now, and I could hear it reading your statements earlier this summer. And I love the idea that you channeled that emotion collectively in a way to move us forward. So Dean Onwuachi-Willig, as you know, I'm interpreting what you're saying as you creating structure for schools to make those changes instead of relying on individual faculty members to do the work. And of course, individual faculty members still have to do the work, but you've created a structure so that schools can sign on and understand the steps that they have to take to begin making those changes. You've also managed to put together the personal and the professional. So many of you managed that delicate balance in a really powerful way. Doing so, I think, actually made your stories and your statements even more powerful. And there's one word in particular that maybe all of you, or at least most of you, have used in your remarks so far, and that's responsibility. And so I want us to take a step back for a moment to consider the bigger picture and responsibility. How can legal education and the legal profession as a whole be involved in fostering an anti-racist society? So you've created this structure for law schools and law deans to follow. Is there something that legal education more broadly and the legal profession as well can do to follow in that anti-racist movement?
So all of us, I'm sure, have to give various welcomes and little speeches and, you know, all of these things all the time. And, you know, one of the things that I say and I came into law school intending to be a public interest lawyer and still sort of think of myself as a public interest lawyer, even though I somehow became a law school dean. I have lots of questions about my life choices. But, you know, one of the things that I say to my students all the time is, you know, our job is to train you and to send you out into the world. You're not all going to become public interest lawyers, but all of you, hopefully, whether you came to law school with it or not, are going to be inculcated with a certain orientation towards justice and fairness and equality by virtue of the legal education that I hope we're giving to you at this law school. And so whether you're in a prosecutor's office or you're a public defender or you're a partner at a white shoe law firm, you should be one of those people in the room who is thinking about who's missing here, what's missing here. What are we doing that we shouldn't be doing? What are we doing not as well as we could be doing it, right? You should be the voice that says, why are there only male partners in 2021, right? That's kind of what I think we should be planting in every single one of our students, no matter where they land, that they can be people who are actively thinking about and it's such a cliche, and yet I think it's so important. How do I individually do things that help make this world a better place? And certainly in this context, how do I do work that allows the spaces that I'm in to be anti-racist spaces, whether they started that way or not?
I mean, I can think of some ways. I mean, one of the ways I think is the way we teach the law, and I think that really requires some students, marginalized students, to really sort of step outside of themselves to sort of understand the law from a perspective that doesn't account for their realities, right? And so we teach the law in a way that assumes that it's objective and neutral. Many people do. And I think that many students who find themselves generally on the margins of society because of their identity experience alienation as a result of that, right? That what we're telling them or what their professors are telling them is just, and what they're telling them is objective and neutral and impartial. And they can see that it's not based on their own experience. It's doing not only those students a disservice sort of mentally, emotionally, in terms of how they're experiencing that work, but it's also doing their classmates a disservice in the sense their classmates can't see all of those sort of built-in inequities and biases. So I would love to see some just sort of shifts in the way that we sort of acknowledge some of the weaknesses, right, and some of the inequities that are sort of built into legal doctrine and built into statutes, all of those things. And then I think Jim Leipold of NALP has really raised some very, very important questions about employment and placement for students of color, particularly African-American graduates, significant disparities in terms of the placement of African-American graduates in private law firms, and has really made a call, right, to everyone. And I think the legal profession really should step back and look and say, why is this happening? And should work to correct that, because I think absolutely that's really critical, and it's critical on so many levels, not just because it suggests something wrong about the hiring practices, potentially, or disturbing maybe, or something that should be corrected. Maybe there's something structural that needs to be corrected in the hiring practices, but also, it's disturbing from a loan perspective and in terms of who's able to pay back loans and things of that nature. Of course, it's a hard thing to change, but I would love for the academy in general to think about the ways in which we mainly give merit aid versus need-based aid. And that is, of course, highly influenced by, rankings. But I think that if we really step back and really took a look at it and saw really the wealth disparities, the payback difficulties, the research that for example, you've done at LSEE, LSE, I guess it's LSE, so I should say LSE. And others have done, just in general, looking in higher education in general, will show that, particular students of color, Black and brown students, have a much harder time paying back their loans, and it takes a long time. And I can't remember, I saw something recently that said that after a certain period of time, white students had paid down their loans by a certain percentage, and Black and brown students were still, it was even higher. It was like 100 and something percent. It had increased rather than decreased on average. And so I think it's really important for us to take a look at all those questions.
So it sounds like from Dean Mutcherson, we understand this to be a collective responsibility. And from Dean Onwuachi-Willig, we've had a few examples with regard to curriculum and pedagogy and employment. I'd love for the rest of you to jump in as well and think about whether, or respond to whether, we are collectively working towards anti-racism now in the legal profession or in legal education
when you think of any of the different arenas, whether it's admissions or hiring, or faculty or leadership, which all of you are eminently qualified to answer, even things like clinics or admission to the bar or any other areas that you may be thinking about.
Well, I think it's go ahead, Dean Pratt.
I was just going to say I'd like to address admission to the bar, because I'd like to see our high courts in each of the states partnering with law schools more to have greater transparency around bar admission, because right now most jurisdictions do not collect racial data on bar pass, and so we can see how badly the bar exam is hurting people of color, particularly African American applicants to the bar. But we know in California, for example, because California does collect that information and share it, that African Americans are disproportionately being shut out of the profession through use of the bar exam. We also know through research that the bar exam does not assure competence to represent people and to protect the public. And so there's this farce that's being paraded around for retention of the bar exam, retention of a tool that we know disproportionately excludes people of color. And we have better ways for ensuring protection of the public, such as, for example, in Kansas, we have a bar exam that tests no Kansas law. So I have no assurance that anyone knows Kansas law when they pass the bar exam, the uniform exam in Kansas, and start practicing. I'd have a greater assurance that they knew how to practice law in Kansas and represent Kansans if they were required to take certain Kansas law-specific coursework while in law school and were required to do a clinic or an externship while in law school practicing law in Kansas. That would give me greater assurance that they know how to practice law in Kansas upon graduation than a bar exam that doesn't test any Kansas law. So I would like to see greater cooperation with our state Supreme Courts, where they sit down with law school leaders and create an ideal curriculum to create another pathway. I'm not saying the bar exam has to disappear altogether, but if we really want diversity in this profession, we need to have diverse pathways to the profession. And having a diploma privilege pathway with a specific set of coursework that students have to complete successfully, in addition to a practicum that students have to complete successfully in that jurisdiction where they are to be licensed, would be a reasonable alternative in my mind. And so I'm hoping that we can have greater transparency so that we know the rate of exclusion of people of color from the bar. And I'm hoping that we can create alternative pathways so that the bar exam is not the only method of entering our profession.
Yes, well said. Well said, Dean Pratt. And I just wanted to call attention to the pipeline into law school and how we think about this moment where anti-racist action is, you know, the vanguard, and let's really strengthen those pipelines. And I wanted to call attention to the Rutgers Race and Law Review. They are holding a symposium, and they're calling for abstracts on a review on building an anti-racist curriculum in law school. So these are the kinds of action steps that can be taken to begin those discussions more deeply, more meaningfully, to determine how do we strengthen our pipeline so that we can build mechanisms of equality by virtue of who has access to law school, who has access to this profession, and who can be part of the solutions to change the structures.
I think the only thing that I would add to all of those very good comments, and I think as we've seen, we have to operate at all of these levels, at admissions, at pipeline, at this consideration of how much students of color are paying for their legal education versus students who are in the majority. We have to ask questions about placement. And I think we need to ask fundamental questions about why a profession that has claimed to be devoted to D&I for the last 40 to 50 years has made no progress. And this question of when you claim to have so many diversity and inclusion efforts, both at law firms and at law schools and throughout the profession, why we are seeing no efforts, and to ask whether we need more accountability, right? Whether there really is, and I think that's a theme that runs through all of our comments, whether it is more transparency about how much are African-American students paying to get an education at this law school versus white students at a particular law school. Is it transparency around, as Dean Pratt was just talking about, access to the profession through the bar exam? But I think we have to shine a light on some of these most difficult questions, because if you don't have progress and yet you have all of these initiatives and efforts, there is definitely a lack of accountability that I think we must begin to, as a collective, I think individual law schools, individual legal employers, but as a profession, we have to do more to hold ourselves accountable around the issue of whether we're an anti-racist profession.
And I think one of the places where accountability is so critical is that both law schools and the legal profession are so saturated with these incredibly elitist myths about meritocracy and superiority and skill. And when you think about it, it's incredibly laughable, right? Look at who's dean, people who teach in law schools or were the dean of law schools. Everybody has to go to an elite law school, and we went to those law schools. We know how much mediocrity exists among those people. And yet we tell ourselves these stories about how if you have that on your CV, it means that you're somebody who's going to be a good law professor. Or if you're getting into law school and you got a good LSAT score, that's a sign that you're going to be a good law student and a good lawyer. And we just tell ourselves these things over and over and over again, or at least allow these stories to be told over and over and over again. And if we can't dismantle those, then we can't be successful in creating anti-racist institutions.
So, believe it or not, we have just 5 minutes left for our time together on this panel. And I will invite you with this last question to reflect on the many different things that have come up so far, and to add to any of those if you'd like. Each of you has given us so much to think about today. The whole day actually has just been this amazing opportunity to reconceptualize legal education and the legal profession as well. So for the closing of the panel, and as a key action-oriented takeaway, since from the beginning of our conversation, we've been really focused on action, I invite each of you to take maybe a minute or so to answer, what can individuals do to be anti-racist, and especially to foster anti-racism in our personal or our professional lives? So if you can each take a minute or so to share key takeaways in terms of what we individually can do to be anti-racist in our own lives.
Well, one of the things that I'll say, and I'll try to, there also were some questions that were asked that I've been reading. But, one of the things that I'll say is how important it is to be a person who is willing to be uncomfortable, and how important it is to be a person who is not afraid of confrontation. And I say that as somebody who is utterly unafraid of confrontation, and I understand that's not how everybody is. But a lot of these conversations are difficult conversations. A lot of this means, sitting, I've been in many a faculty meeting over the years where I was the only Black person in the room, right? And I was the one who was consistently raising particular issues. It just can't be that way. It's got to be that everybody is willing to be that voice. You're not the person who comes up after the meeting and says, I totally agree with you, but you didn't say it in the meeting, so that's useless to me. So, really sort of forcing people, particularly as we're thinking about our curricula and how we're changing them and what we're asking people to do in the classroom, you have to act in ways that are protective of your fellow faculty members. And you have to be willing to say to people, I heard what you just said, and here are all the things that are wrong with it. And folks don't always want to say that. Like, we'll say that about people's scholarship in a whole range of different ways, but we won't say, you're claiming that this candidate who happens to be a person of color just doesn't feel like they're going to fit in at the law school. I need you to unpack that, right? Like, that's not just an acceptable response. And we're not going to just say that that's okay because that's how you feel. So those kinds of conversations, I think, are absolutely imperative, and they're difficult. And sometimes they make people upset and angry. But if you're not going to get upset and angry, then again, we're not going to achieve anything.
So takeaway number one. Takeaway number one from Dean Mutcherson, I would summarize as be that voice.
I'll jump in and I will say very concretely, when you see your leadership attempting this audacious approach to anti-racist education, be the faculty member, be the student, be the administrator who stands up and says to someone who wants to poo-poo these efforts,
yes,
why are you against this?
Mm-hmm.
Just ask them the question.
Yes.
Why are you against this? Isn't this a form of learning, and isn't law about transferable skills? So don't be the student, don't be the faculty member, don't be the staff member, don't be the colleague who says, ooh, I know, isn't that a mess? We shouldn't even be doing that. Don't be that person. I'll consider that action if you don't act that way.
So takeaway number two from Dean Conway, I would say maybe, beyond this particular project, but with anti-racism generally, you can ask yourselves when it's necessary, and also make sure you ask others, why are you against this?
I would add that, for many of us, we are used to, being the only one in the room. So whether you're the only, Black faculty member, or you have only, 1 or 2% of the law students in your law school are African-American or people of color, I think this anti-racist work cannot be the burden of, Black and brown law students, law faculty, staff, and leadership. So if you are someone in your space who is not, a member of one of these groups, who's not one of this group, please make sure that you're doing the work, right? For so many of us, this is, our hard work. This is passion work. We would do this work no matter what. But it can also be a tremendous burden, a burden of time, something that in your own work, Mary, you've written about so beautifully, in the way that it can stand in the way of people, getting tenure. It can stand in the way of people getting hired. It can stand in the way of students graduating and passing the bar. The work of making their own spaces tolerable is work that we cannot press upon just the people who are really vulnerable to what is happening in these spaces. So I 1000% agree. Don't be against it. And not only that, you must be for it, right? You must stand up. That's the whole project of anti-racism, is for people who are not directly impacted by racism itself to stand up and have their voices heard.
So takeaway number 3, I would summarize as do the work or step up.
I guess I would jump in and say that I think that I think the action I would say, one of the really important action to do is really truly reflect on how race has shaped your life. To do a deep examination. How has race shaped my life? Not think of race as something that just only other people have, and think about how it shaped their lives. But how has it shaped your life? How have you benefited or been disadvantaged, or what are the invisible ways in which race and racism work for you or against you. And then I would say is to really then take your ego out of it and to not always see yourself as the exception, right? So there are people, I think, who view themselves as anti-racist who make an exception when it's their person, right? So, you know, they're critical of, like, you know, people's, you know, for example, let's say we're hiring or we're admitting someone or we're looking at some particular person, they can see and understand the racist comments that other people make. They don't see it in themselves. When it's their person, they're willing to throw away all those values. And I think you have to, in the same way that you can see, I guess, is that be able to see the way in which comments and talks about racism and the ways in which individuals can facilitate and have facilitated racism may also apply to you. I mean, I think they apply to all of us, right? And so we all have to do that hard work of engaging in that very, very deep, hard internal reflection.
So the fourth takeaway then from Dean Onwuachi-Willig, I had like a long version of it, but I think actually it can easily be summarized as look inward and then apply those lessons.
And I don't think I have anything really unique to say in addition to what's already been said, but I think I would add, work on educating yourself by reading the works of authors of color. One of the questions in the chat, and I hate that we didn't have enough time to get to the questions, but one of them was, are there any suggestions for dealing productively with negative student evaluations stemming from raising racism issues in class, especially for professors who do not have tenure? And that broke my heart because I had that same experience. I was the lone person teaching about racism in class without tenure, and I looked like the kook on the faculty. And so my suggestion to that person is, to her colleagues, don't let her be out there on that limb alone. Educate yourselves. You're all very highly educated, very smart people who are capable of becoming competent to teach about race and racism in your class. And if you think your class doesn't deal with race or racism, I encourage you to go and look at the literature. Every subject that we teach cuts across race and racism. And so, I really want to implore us to educate ourselves as educators so that we are equipped to teach about these issues in the classroom, so that our untenured colleagues who are coming along behind us trying to do this anti-racism work aren't out there on a limb by themselves looking like they're the racist kook.
So Dean Pratt's takeaway, I'll actually use as a way to wrap up our conversation, and that's to look at the fabulous Black women deans who are on this panel and learn from them, learn from others who aspire to their example. And there is lots of literature. Much of it is included in the Law Dean's Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project website. So they've done the hard work for all of us. They've created the structure so that we can put the words that we've been speaking into action. And so this is now our opportunity to take the hard work that they've done and encourage it and support it and be reflective and educate ourselves and be more action oriented to work towards anti-racism. So with that, I will ask you all to join me in thanking our fabulous 5 women deans for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge with us. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.